My name is Stuffed Kitty, and after spending the last 3 weeks shoved down between a wall and a bed, I decided that I needed my own place. It started out pretty basic, with just some blueprints and spare plywood, and I conned some humans into working for me by sitting close enough and purring. It's pretty easy to get humans to work for you. This guy is called Big Mike. He's the one who handled all the tough and noisy work. Had the know-how with all the tools, what they were, and how to use them and how to keep all your claws attached in the process. Also, he was pretty good at scratching behind my ears for me, and an even easier target for surprise razor attacks when he scratched my ears for too long. This is the wood that they used to make my new pad. I think it was found in some pile of scraps, but that doesn't really bother me too much because it looked like it would be pretty nice to rip up with my claws on a nice afternoon. The first thing that had to get done was cutting wood. Unfortunately, as a modern stuffed cat, I was not going to be happy with some kind of two-bit grudge fest. I'm clearly a creature of style. If I wasn't going to have a cardboard box, I was at least going to have something else decent out of these suckers. And, that meant that they needed to make some shapes. Initially, they used this thing called a table saw. The first time they ran it, I hauled ass out of the shop and found a nice spot behind a cabinet. I moved so fast I bet they thought the noise scared me. What suckers. Anyway, I curled up in the middle of a doorway, which is prime real estate for tripping up other humans who aren't paying attention, carrying things like lifelong masterpieces or tins full of paint. My workers had plenty of work to do. There was a lot for them to cut out, and somehow they managed to take all the time in the world to do it. It seemed like every time I came out for check-in, they were drawing lines, or lining some hunk of wood up with some kind of saw. I guess that's okay with me though, because I'm pretty sure that humans don't have much else to do with their time other than to serve us cats. So, I really can't begrudge them for trying to draw out their usefulness as much as possible. Then, other times, I caught them just standing around and talking about what they were doing. It got kind of cyclical. I would catch them mouthing about the work that they weren't doing, and start batting at their ankles and dropping elbows. They would get back on it after that, but before long, there would be more ankles that needed disciplining. It happened a lot. At one point, they got their act together and actually had some good ideas. Like, eventually it occurred to my workers to start labeling all the shapes that they were cutting out. I had thought of that earlier, but I think letting them think it was their idea made them feel better. And at one point, things got a little mixed up, and the workers actually used a different saw or two. Of course, somehow using that new saw didn't change the fact that Big Mike spent one of my lifetimes adjusting the placement of the wood by the saw, like he did for every new piece of wood that they cut out. And then they cut with that saw. I think it was called a circle saw, or a waffle saw, or something. I didn't care enough to commit it to memory, since, my short-term memory only lasts about 2 weeks anyway. The point is, they cut a bunch of wood with this one too. Lots of wood, over and over. Occasionally something new got put into the mix, but for the most part, it was kept down to 4 main machines, and a whole lot of rulers and pencils, and maybe a marker. Here, just watch, you'll see. This is one of my other worker suckers. She's called Taylor. She's responsible for the concept of my new pad, and mostly did stuff like measurements or painting. You know, the delicate, wimpy stuff that you don't expect some juggernaut of a guy to be doing. I think I heard her say things like, "Wait, no, what are you doing?" more often than I rip out the sides of couches. Oh, and sometimes they used her as a paperweight. By the second day, I didn't even bother coming to check on them, because it was just more of the same stuff. They cut things out with a saw. They doped around with rulers and pencils to do measuring. They realized that both their cuts and their measurements were totally wrong, and did the whole thing again. That was the process. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and say that going back and forth like that must have been on purpose. I'm so generous. The next day, they actually seemed to be making progress. It wasn't much, but they finally got around to getting some glue out and trying to attach some of the pieces together. It's remarkable how long it took them to get the first nail in. It was like these suckers had never done cat-based construction in their lives. I'm sure that can't be true, though. That idea's wacko. At one point, one of them dripped glue all over the floor. I ended up walking through it. Naturally, I resented having to walk around like I was goose-stepping to detach my paw from the floor for the next 5 minutes, so I went ahead and put a fur ball in one of their shoes that night. Anyway, that's the overview of how the first stage went. You would think that after all the cutting was done, all the cutting would be done, but that's not actually how it went. Still, this next part is mostly about sanding the wood down and getting all the pieces together, like, assembled. Oh, and I may have forgotten to mention that they had holes to cut out, too. A whole bunch of holes had to get trimmed out. I don't know how much you know about cats. I'm sure it's a lot, because that's just how the universe works, being centered around us and all. But boxes aren't much use to us unless we can actually get into them. So they cut holes. They also cut some holes out in weird places. A lot of them were too small for a cat to fit through. I didn't argue, though, mostly because, at that point, I was more interested in the moths that kept flying around that girl who was working with sharp knives. Then they got the vacuum out again. I was pretty pissed this time, too. I think they were doing it just to spite me. The next day was a lot more of the same stuff. Sanding and assembling. Assembling and sanding. Really, the former order makes a lot more sense. These suckers didn't have a knack for doing everything right the first time. Or the 5th. Or the 12th. Some of it was starting to take a little bit of a shape. I did my fair share of inspecting at the beginning of it. You know, when I had interest in doing things that didn't involve basking in the sun or being a living obstacle. They could have been doing a worse job. You know, if only they had been able to pay attention the whole time. They did eventually bring out some interesting new tools, like a nail gun, a drill with screws, and this handheld sanding wand called a Dremel. I had lost interest at that point, though, and passed the time by napping in the middle of the stairwell. I wasn't really feeling doorways that day. By the afternoon, I decided it was worth my time to come back and see how things were coming, make sure nothing had blown up, caught fire. I found them standing there having an entire conversation about the piece that they were trying to put together. They said something about lunch, but that didn't make sense to me. It sounded like some kind of break for food, but I don't eat in the middle of the day, so I'm sure the same is true for them. They're working for me. What's worse is that it wasn't the only time I caught them doing it, and, it actually went on for a while. I don't want to talk about how much glue or how many nails went into the whole construction project. I think some of them may be there just because my workers were venting some kind of frustration. Which is silly, because they wouldn't be tense if they spent as much time as I do laying around and letting people work for them. That's obviously the answer. I wasn't impressed by the speed they were going at. It had been a few days, and my new pad wasn't ready and complete and perfect. Taylor eventually started using more tools, and, look, I told you she got used as a paperweight. And then Big Mike turned around and started making measurements. The whole thing got twisted backwards. At one point, they started trimming off nails that were sticking out of the wood, mostly because they couldn't do things right the first time around. Anyway, it pretty much speaks for itself. Sit back and watch the light show. By the end of that day, they did finally get the thing put together. They still had to make it look nice, which I don't really care about, but I'm open to trying new things. But the actual construction process was almost done at this point. A small part of me was actually getting excited about it now. Only a small part of me though. Let's be realistic. Most of me was still busy thinking about food and getting in people's way. The next thing they did was cover it in this stuff called wood putty and then sand it back off. My workers said something about the putty filling in all the little holes and cracks to make the surface more smooth. All I know is that the stuff looked like runny Fancy Feast and that they had to get the vacuum back out to scare me off and stop me from eating it. I couldn't really blame them for playing dirty like that after the hairballs in their shoes. I might have had a similar problem with the stain they started to put on it. That stuff going on signaled the beginning of the final stretch, which nobody was about to argue with. But it looked like some kind of dark meat broth, and I might have taken interest in tasting it if it didn't smell like it could take my hair off. Maybe they were getting eager to finish the job for me, because it seemed like they were more productive that day than usual. Or maybe it's because I took a 5-hour nap. Either way, they stained it fairly quickly. It seemed like they had a pretty tricky time getting some of the stain into the nooks and crannies on the inside of the box. I probably could have helped out, but again, I'm trying to be realistic with my commentary. I probably wouldn't have done that even if it had occurred to me. Suddenly the only thing left for my workers to do was attach that luscious sisal carpet to it. I went ahead and started ripping some of it up while they cut it out, but I was willing to take a brief reprieve to allow them to finish their job. By reprieve, I mean I attacked their ankles. It was fun. And finally, the job was complete. Now, take a moment to admire my new place. So what do you think? It's right up my alley. I figure I'll be having a tree warming party with friends pretty soon. It'll be a good time. I predict spending a lot of time right here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here.